Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Pierce called her during rounds, his voice sliding between the residents like oil on water. Elena Martinez didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She moved past him to the medication cart, her badge catching the fluorescent light, and continued charting a post-op abdominal repair with the precision of someone who'd sutured worse in the dark. He had no idea why every supply requisition she filed came back flagged. He had no idea that the 7-month gap in her employment history, redacted in her application, sealed in a vault somewhere north of the Pentagon, was the reason her probationary period felt less like a trial and more like a test she didn't know she was taking. St. Michael's Hospital sprawled across 14 floors of Savannah brick and modern glass, the kind of regional trauma center that drew cases from 3 states. Elena had landed there 6 months ago with a fake social security number that was entirely real, a nursing credential that was entirely genuine, and a limp on her left side that no one asked about. The limp was from a sucking chest wound in Tikrit that had healed wrong, the kind of wrong that never fully went away, the kind that whispered when she climbed stairs and screamed when it rained. She wore compression socks to work. Nobody noticed. The trauma unit smelled like antiseptic and possibility, the particular sting of bleach cutting through the metallic undertone of old blood in the corners where the mop never quite reached. Elena had smelled worse. She had smelled burning flesh and diesel fuel and the copper iron reek of exsanguination. She had smelled her own blood, too. The antiseptic was almost pleasant by comparison. Her shift began at 0630. And by 0700 she was elbow-deep in a routine admission, a 63-year-old male with a crushed hand from a dock accident, brought in by ambulance with what the paramedics had charted as significant soft-tissue trauma. The attending, Dr. Sarah Chen, was already at the bedside when Elena pushed through the doors, her stethoscope hanging like a weight around her neck. The patient, Robert Keene, according to the chart, was conscious and pale, his left hand wrapped in field gauze that was soaking through at the 4th knuckle. Elena moved to the bedside without being asked. This was the part that made her dangerous, the part that made Dr. Pierce watch her the way a predator watches something that moves differently from the herd. She didn't wait for the attending's assessment. She didn't ask permission. She unwrapped the gauze with the economical precision of muscle memory, her fingers working the tissue with the kind of speed that came from having done this in a field hospital that officially never existed, under conditions that were officially never discussed. 3 seconds. That's all it took to map the wound architecture. Shrapnel dispersal pattern. Depth of penetration. Tissue viability by quadrant. The crushing injury had a fingerprint, the pattern of whatever had caught his hand told a story about force vectors and impact velocity and whether the tendon repair would hold or fail within 6 months. Elena's hands moved through the assessment like they were reading Braille, touching nothing but seeing everything. Crush injury with punctate lacerations, she said, her voice steady and low, meant only for Dr. Chen. Look at the stellate pattern here and here. Whatever caught him had sharp edges. Industrial press, probably. Hand press from the warehouse district, they used the older models. No guards. Dr. Chen looked at her. Then looked at the hand. Then looked back at Elena with an expression that suggested she'd just watched someone translate a language she hadn't known existed. That's a very specific assessment for a triage nurse, Dr. Chen said carefully. Elena was already reaching for the sterile drape. Work trauma assessment in the field. Long time ago. She didn't say the military. She didn't say SEAL team. She didn't say 3 tours in Helmand province and 1 in Anbar that was never officially logged. She just kept working, her fingers moving with the terrible grace of someone who'd held lives together when the only tools available were what you could carry in a pack, and the only light was what didn't draw sniper fire. Dr. Pierce arrived at 0740, his presence announced by the particular silence that fell over the nurse's station when someone with institutional power enters a room. He was tall in the way that mattered, not physically, but socially. Tailored shirt that probably cost more than Elena's monthly rent. Watch that caught the light like a weapon. The kind of face that had never been told no by anyone who mattered. He moved to the bedside and displaced Dr. Chen with the subtle choreography of hierarchy. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. He looked at Elena's work, the hand reassessed and prepped, the vascular flow documented, the tissue viability mapped with the kind of precision that suggested either genuine expertise or terrifying confidence. He looked at the patient. He looked at Elena. "The charting on this is unusual," he said, not to Elena, but to the room, as if she weren't standing 3 feet away. He was holding her assessment notes, the one she'd written with measured, clinical language that read like a field hospital report if you knew how to read field hospital reports. Most people didn't. Most people never would. "It's accurate," Elena said. "It's dangerous civilian shortcuts," Pierce said, and he said it the way someone says a fact about weather, not cruel, just inevitable. Impressionistic instead of systematic. The kind of thing that looks good in the moment but falls apart in a lawsuit. He looked at the residents who'd gathered like hungry dogs. Note the lack of standard assessment protocol. This is what happens when nurses start thinking they're physicians. He handed the chart back to Dr. Chen and walked away, leaving the silence intact behind him like a wound that wouldn't close. Elena didn't move. Her hands didn't shake. Her jaw didn't clench. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. She touched the inside of her jacket where the patch sat hidden beneath the polyester and cotton, the faded emblem sewn into the lining in thread so old it had turned grey. The patch bore the insignia of a unit that had been decommissioned, buried, scrubbed from official records. The kind of unit that appeared in no databases, claimed no decorations, and trained killers to save lives in the same breath. She'd been told to disappear. That was the deal when the operation was over, when the classified work in Tikrit was finished and the bodies were counted and the reports were filed in vaults beneath the Pentagon. Disappear. Change your name. Change your face. Change your life. Get a civilian job. Live quietly. Never acknowledge what you did or who you were or the 47 people you pulled out of a kill zone that the military officially never entered. She'd done it. She'd left the service, burned her uniforms, changed her last name from Reyes to Martinez, her mother's maiden name, picked almost at random. She'd taken the nursing credential she'd maintained for operational necessity and made it her life. She'd been invisible for 7 months. Right up until Dr. Pierce decided to make her visible, one flagged requisition at a time. By lunchtime, Elena pulled her file, the thick probationary folder that sat in HR with all the weight of an unspoken threat. Every supply request she'd filed since arriving was stamped with a red flag and a question mark. For kits? Flagged, query on page for asking why she was requesting 14-gauge needles when 18-gauge was standard. Trauma shears? Flagged, notation that she'd requested the model with the tungsten carbide blade instead of stainless steel. The specificity of her requests was exactly what made them dangerous. The specificity was how someone flagged you. She was sitting in the break room on the 4th floor when Pierce pushed through the doors. He didn't acknowledge her presence. He just filled a coffee mug, black, no sugar, the mug reading Doctor of the Year 1997, and turned to leave. He paused at the door like he'd forgotten something important, then turned back. "Your supply orders are being flagged for a reason," he said, still not quite looking at her. "Hospital policy requires standardized equipment requisitions. Whatever you learned in civilian EMT training, it doesn't apply here. We follow protocols. We follow guidelines. We don't improvise." Elena set her sandwich down. "Acknowledged. I'm putting you on shift overlap with Dr. Holloway's surgical patients," Pierce continued. "His cases tend to be complex. Good learning opportunity for someone at your level." He left before she could respond. The overlap assignments had nothing to do with learning. Dr. Holloway was the most litigious physician on staff, the one with 3 open malpractice suits and a reputation for blaming nursing staff when outcomes didn't match his expectations. Being assigned to his patients during a probationary period was like being handed a sword and being told to fall on it at the optimal angle. Everyone at St. Michael's knew this. Pierce knew this. The knowing was the point. Elena touched her jacket again, feeling the patch through the fabric. Old embroidery. Older memories. The patch had been through 3 field hospitals, 2 medical evacs, and 1 explosion that had killed everyone else in the Humvee but her. She never took it off. She never even looked at it. She just touched it and remembered what it meant to be useful, to be trusted, to be something more than a probationary nurse that a doctor could slowly destroy with flagged requisitions and shift assignments. The next shift was 1600 to 2400, and by 1930 the first casualty had arrived, not from battle, but from a machinery accident at the rail yard. The patient was screaming, his leg crushed below the knee, and Elena was moving toward him before the attending called for anyone. What happened next changed everything. The Grand Rounds Theatre at St. Michael's filled like a coliseum. Tiered seating rose in semicircles around the presentation stage, and 50 residents and attending physicians filtered in with coffee cups and open laptops, settling into the posture of people ready to be impressed or bored. Elena stood at the periphery with her chart in Dr. Pierce's hands, watching him slide the first page onto the projection screen. Her documentation magnified across 20 feet of wall, her handwriting, her assessment, her clinical decisions rendered large enough to dissect in front of an amphitheater of judges. This, Pierce announced, circling one section with a laser pointer's red dot, is what I call dangerous civilian shortcuts. The room quieted. Elena's jaw tightened, but she kept her face a mask of stone, her eyes flat and cold as lake ice. Note the incomplete assessment here. Nurse Martinez assumes field expedience translates to hospital protocol. It does not. He turned to face her directly, making sure the residents understood the lesson was about her incompetence. When personnel decide protocol doesn't apply to them, patients suffer. Lives become statistics. A resident shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with the public crucifixion. Another took notes, dutifully documenting the critique of the probationary nurse who stood 3 feet from the podium, close enough to hear every word but far enough to be isolated. Pierce advanced to the next slide, another page of her charting, another circle, another lecture on the gaps between her thinking and the hospital standards. The red dot moved like a scalpel, cutting through her work. Elena didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She simply stood there, present and silent, giving him nothing, no tears, no stammering defense, no visible crack in her composure. The mask held. Finally, Pierce paused for breath, turning slightly as if inviting her to respond, to defend herself, to show some sign of the distress he was clearly working to provoke. Elena met the silence for 3 full seconds. Then she spoke, her voice level and surgical. The patient in 4B is still waiting for the imaging you ordered 6 hours ago, doctor. The room went dead silent. She turned on her heel and walked toward the exit, her steps steady and unhurried, while 2 residents stared at their shoes. Behind her, she heard Pierce's voice rise. That's insubordination, Nurse Martinez, but she was already gone, the doors closing behind her with a soft pneumatic hiss. The afternoon collapsed into routine until she found herself at the vending machine on the 3rd floor, selecting coffee from the carousel of polystyrene cups. The machine hummed its industrial rhythm. Behind her, voices carried from the break room, and she heard an attending she didn't recognize say, "Pierce is going to eat her alive. She's the fired nurse who doesn't know it yet." Laughter followed. Another voice, "I give her 2 weeks." Elena's hand didn't shake as she retrieved her coffee. She didn't turn around. She watched the cup drop into the collection tray with a soft clink, then opened the compartment and took it without expression. The voices behind her trailed off as she walked past the break room door. They'd seen her. They knew she'd heard. The gossip was the message, confirmation that her termination was already written, already scheduled, just waiting for Dr. Pierce to pull the trigger. She took the stairwell instead of the elevator. Concrete and fluorescent light, the sound of her shoe soles echoing in the empty column. No mirrors to catch her reflection, no one to see the tightness around her eyes. That evening, Pierce materialized beside her at the nurse's station like a man who'd been waiting for the right moment. Elena was entering medication notes into the computer when she caught his cologne first, expensive and cloying, the scent of someone used to filling rooms with his presence. She didn't look up. The security guard was visible down the hallway, positioned as if waiting for a signal. "Your probationary period can end with an escort and an empty locker, Miss Martinez," Pierce said quietly, close enough that only she could hear. "Keep that in mind." He let the threat hang in the air between them, watching her face for fear, for resignation, for anything that suggested he'd successfully broken her resolve. Elena met his eyes once, a single cold glance that held no fear and no defiance, just a kind of blank assessment, the way someone might regard an obstacle they were already calculating how to move around. Then she turned back to her charting without a word, her fingers resuming their rhythm on the keyboard, each keystroke a small act of refusal to give him the reaction he wanted. Pierce lingered for 2 seconds longer, waiting for her to recant or apologize or show some sign of the terror his threat was supposed to inspire. She didn't. He left, and Elena continued documenting vital signs with the same precision she would have used if nothing had been said at all. The radio crackled at 18:47 hours, incoming trauma, 34-year-old male, unconscious, suspected toxic exposure from environmental hazard, ETA for minutes. Elena was restocking trauma 2 when the call came through, arranging equipment in the precise order she'd learned in places the hospital would never acknowledge. Fluid warmers. Rapid infusers. Suction catheters arranged by gauge. Her hands moved with the muscle memory of someone who understood that the difference between a save and a body bag was often measured in seconds. She'd barely finished when the first responders burst through the doors with a gurney moving at a sprint. She saw the build first. Mid-30s, broad shoulders, the specific muscle development of someone who carried heavy gear long distances, a precision athlete's physiology, refined by years of operational demand. Navy SEAL, her mind catalogued instantly, before her eyes found the vitals monitor. The attending was barking orders, establishing a scene of controlled chaos. 2 large bore 4s, get me a line now, type and cross, full panel, lactate, we're looking at septic shock. Elena was already moving toward Trauma Bay 2, where the man was being transferred from the EMS stretcher. His name was visible on a clipboard, Marcus Hale, 34, no medical allergies listed. He was seizing, his skin mottled with the kind of pallor that came from profound systemic infection, his vitals crashing across the monitors with terrifying speed. Blood pressure dropping. Heart rate climbing. Oxygen saturation falling. The attending continued calling orders, but Elena was moving faster than protocol, her hands establishing access with the kind of efficiency that made the resident step back. She found what they were looking for in his left shoulder, an old entry wound, the tissue around it necrotic and black, the infection spreading into his bloodstream like a fire-consuming wood. Retained shrapnel. Years old. The kind of wound that killed slowly if you didn't know what you were looking at. She began debriding the wound track with a surgical touch, her fingers moving with precision to trace the fragment path, to understand how deep the contamination went. Something in her technique, the angle of entry, the way she tracked the trajectory through muscle and fascia, made Hale's eyes flutter open for just a moment. He was half-conscious, pupils dilated, his breathing labored, but some part of his brain recognized something in the way she was working. He whispered, "You worked the Euphrates route." His voice was barely audible under the monitor alarms and the attending's continued commands, barely more than breath. But Elena heard it. Her hands froze for a fraction of a second. She met his eyes once, a single moment of connection that felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, and then she shook her head in silence and kept working, her fingers resuming their precise movements, her face showing nothing. Across the room, a nurse asked, "Did he just say something?" Elena didn't answer. She didn't look up. She was already moving to the next phase, her hands working with a speed and certainty that had the residents following her lead without question. Pierce appeared in the doorway then, observing, his arms crossed. He watched for maybe 30 seconds, watching how Elena was managing the case, watching how she was taking lead without authorization, watching how the residents were following her orders as if she had the right to give them. His jaw tightened. Elena could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the recalibration of his strategy. He pulled the attending aside. Their conversation was quiet, but Elena watched the attending's expression shift, first confusion, then understanding, then a kind of grim resignation. When the attending returned to the trauma bay, his voice had changed. "Dr. Pierce will be supervising this case personally. Step back to observe a role, Elena." Elena stepped back, her gloved hand still raised, the warmth of the wound work still radiating from her palms. She watched Pierce take over with textbook protocol, methodical, by the book, textbook perfect in every way that made it 15 seconds too slow for what this patient needed. Hale's vitals spiked on the monitor. Pressure dropping faster. Lactate climbing. The window closing. But that wasn't the worst part. The stretcher wheel squeaked against polished tile as the trauma team rushed Hale through the bay doors, his body slack, his breathing shallow and irregular. Mid-30s, muscular, the kind of build that came from a decade of force marches and impossible distances. His skin had taken on a grayish cast. One of the resident physicians called out vitals while another stripped away his shirt, revealing the wound, a deep puncture track along his left flank, angry red tissue surrounding a dark entrance point where something metallic had driven deep into his abdomen. Shrapnel. The tissue around the wound showed early signs of necrotic burn, the kind of systemic poisoning that happened when certain military-grade metals oxidized inside living flesh. Elena stood at the edge of the controlled chaos, her eyes moving across the wound track with the precision of someone who had seen this exact pattern before. Not at St. Michael's. Somewhere else. Somewhere official records didn't mention. The resident was already reaching for the antibiotics cart when Elena stepped forward, her voice pitched low and steady. That track suggests deep penetration. Likely fragmentation from a blast radius, possibly tungsten or depleted uranium compound. The words came out clinical, professional, but they carried weight, the weight of experience no probationary nurse at a civilian hospital should possess. The resident hesitated, looking between Elena and the attending, unsure whose authority superseded whose. Hale's eyes fluttered open at that moment, unfocused at first, then sharpening with the kind of alertness that only came from a lifetime of waking up in dangerous places. His gaze locked onto Elena's face. His lips moved, barely audible over the ventilator being prepared beside him. You worked the Euphrates route. Not a question. A recognition. His breathing was labored, his voice rough, but certain. The words hung in the trauma bay like a classified document someone had just left on a table. The resident froze. The attending didn't notice. Elena met his eyes once, just once, her face completely still, expressionless as stone, her eyes flat and cold as lake ice. Then she looked away. She didn't nod. She didn't confirm anything. The silence was her answer. Hale closed his eyes again, understanding settled into his features, the recognition of someone meeting a fellow soldier who had lived through the same impossible things. The attending had turned away to check Hale's pupils with a penlight, missing the entire exchange. Dr. Pierce arrived 3 minutes later, moving through the trauma bay with the kind of proprietary authority that came from someone who believed the hospital belonged to him more than it belonged to anyone else. His eyes swept across the monitors, across the wound, across Elena standing 2 steps back from the active resuscitation. Broad-spectrum antibiotics, stat. IV lines, push fluids, get him typed and cross-matched for 4 units. His tone was decisive, practiced, the voice of a physician who had said these exact words 1,000 times in 1,000 trauma bays. Elena stepped forward, her composure intact, her voice controlled and clinical. The wound track suggests toxic metallic contamination. The necrosis pattern indicates rapid oxidative burn. Broad-spectrum coverage won't address the systemic poisoning. Pierce's eyes shifted toward her, and something flickered across his face, not concern, but annoyance at being contradicted in front of the team. Emergency surgical extraction and tissue debridement would be the standard protocol. Elena continued, her voice still perfectly measured. Before the septic cascade compounds the initial trauma. Pierce set down his tablet with deliberate slowness. He didn't raise his voice. The quietness was worse than if he had shouted. We're not a field hospital, Nurse Martinez. We have protocols. We have standards of care established by the American College of Surgeons, not by probationary staff with opinions about procedures outside their scope. His eyes moved back to the attending. Schedule him for OR in the morning. 12 hours of observation, for antibiotics, pain management, vitals every 30 minutes. He picked up his tablet again, made a note, and added without looking at Elena, I'm documenting your repeated challenges to physician authority. It's becoming a pattern. The words landed like a blade between her ribs. Not because they hurt, they didn't. But because they were calculated. He was building something. A narrative. A case. He was establishing, for the record, that Elena Martinez was unreliable, that her clinical judgment was compromised, that her presence on this case was a liability rather than an asset. The evening shift transitioned to night shift at 1900 hours. Elena remained on the unit, though she wasn't assigned to Hale's direct care. She had been reassigned to post-op recovery, to general med-surg, to every corner of the hospital that put distance between her and the patient she understood. But she found herself moving through the corridors, passing the monitors that tracked his vital signs, reading the numbers the way other people read newspapers. Temperature climbing. 101.2, 102.1. 102.8 by 2,100 hours. His pressure starting its downward creep, 140/88, then 135/85, then 128/80. The monitors told a story Pierce was choosing not to read. The shrapnel was still in there, still oxidizing, still poisoning the tissue from the inside out. Every hour they waited was an hour the cascade continued, microscopic damage accumulating into systemic failure. At 0130, Elena found Pierce in the hallway outside Hale's room, his tablet glowing in the dim light, the fluorescent ceiling fixtures casting everything in that particular shade of institutional gray. His eyes were fixed on his screen, scrolling through notes, writing, documenting. "He needs surgery now," Elena said quietly. "The toxicity is overwhelming his system. His cardiac markers are starting to elevate. Once the sepsis window opens, resuscitation becomes impossible." Pierce didn't look up. He didn't pause in his typing. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to lean forward to hear it clearly. "Your opinion is noted and disregarded. Return to your assigned duties." He made a notation in his phone. Elena heard the keyboard click, the tiny sound of judgment being recorded, then added, "I'm seeing a concerning pattern of insubordination. It's being documented. Every instance." He looked up at her then, his eyes flat and professional and utterly certain of his power. "Understand?" Elena understood perfectly. He was building the termination case before the patient was even dead. He was establishing that she had challenged him, that she had been warned, that her removal from the hospital was inevitable and justified. She turned and walked away. What else was there to do? At 0145, Hale's monitor alarmed. Ventricular fibrillation. His heart had simply stopped coordinating, electricity without rhythm, life support collapsing from the toxic load. The crash team moved as one unit, charged the defibrillator, pushed epi, bagged oxygen into his lungs. One shock. His heart resumed its chaotic rhythm. 2 minutes of compressions. Another shock. Sinus rhythm came back, weak and irregular but present. They brought him back. The team stood sweating around the bed, exhausted already, and Hale's eyes opened for just a moment. He saw Elena standing in the doorway. His expression didn't change. He already knew what was happening. He already knew what Pierce had decided. He already knew that dying on a schedule was going to be his outcome. Elena pulled Hale's chart from the slot outside his door and opened it in the hallway, the pages cool and slick beneath her fingers. Pierce had already written the night notes. She read them slowly, methodically, her jaw tightening by fractions of a millimeter as she processed each word. Probationary nurse made inappropriate surgical recommendations beyond her scope of practice. Physician correctly applied current standard of care protocols. Recommended observation and antibiotic therapy per trauma guidelines. No indication for emergency surgery at this time. Clinical judgment of probationary staff questioned during multiple patient encounters. Documentation of concerns initiated for personnel file. The narrative was perfect. It was airtight. It was designed to make her look reckless and him look reasonable. He was building his case, word by word, note by note, establishing that whatever happened to Hale was Elena's failure to accept proper authority, not his failure to recognize a medical emergency. At 0155, Hale coded again. This time, the crash team was slower getting to the room. Elena watched from the hall, watched his heart flatline on the monitor, watched them restart it, watched them bring him back again. His heart was weakening with every arrest. The muscle was dying. They were just delaying the inevitable now. The attending looked exhausted, running on coffee and adrenaline, his hands shaking slightly as he pushed another round of epi. Pierce was in the hallway with his arms crossed, watching with the calm detachment of someone who had already made peace with the outcome. He wasn't surprised. He had known this would happen. At 0200, the monitor showed a flat line. No waves. No electrical activity. Just the steady tone of a heart that had stopped working. The crash team moved automatically, chest compressions beginning immediately, the sound of ribs cracking under the force of hands trying to restart life through blunt force trauma. Elena's hands were clenched at her sides. Her breathing was controlled. But the trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The kind of restraint that came from having been trained to act, to move, to save, and having been forced to stand still and watch instead. 1 minute of compressions. 2 minutes. 3. The attending looked at Pierce. Pierce nodded. Time of death, 0203. The words were spoken with clinical precision, as though they had always been inevitable. The attending stepped back. The compression stopped. Hale's body went still on the bed, the machines around him continuing their useless monitoring, tracking the vital signs of someone who no longer needed them. The room went silent except for the ventilator wheeze and the steady drip of the fall line. Elena stood in the hallway. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She turned and walked back to the nurse's station, where Pierce was already opening his laptop, composing the incident report that would paint her as reckless, incompetent, and dangerous. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 30 seconds later, when she looked up from her station and saw Pierce making a phone call, his voice low and careful, speaking to someone she couldn't identify. Yes. The patient expired at 0203. The probationary nurse I mentioned was present during the case. She made multiple inappropriate recommendations that I documented accordingly. I think it would be prudent to initiate the termination process immediately. We don't need this kind of liability on our staff. He listened for a moment, then said, "Thank you. I appreciate your discretion with this matter." He hung up and looked directly at Elena across the room. He smiled. He shouldn't have. Because in that moment, with that smile, he had moved from strategic sabotage to something far more dangerous. He had declared victory too early. He had forgotten who he was standing next to. He had no idea that the woman he was destroying had once held the lives of 47 soldiers in her hands and brought them all home. He had no idea what happened when you cornered someone with nothing left to lose. The attending's hands moved with mechanical precision. Compressions. 1, 2, 3. The ribs compressed and released, compressed and released. Hale's chest caved beneath the heels of the palms like dough that wouldn't hold its shape. The monitor showed chaos, no rhythm, just electrical noise spilling across the screen like static. A nurse called out the time. 0201, the attending didn't pause. He nodded. Epi pushed. 1 milligram 4, the syringe plunging and air hissing from the line. The attending checked the monitor. Still nothing. Shock pads. 200 joules, Hale's body arched upward, muscles contracting against gravity, then fell slack like a puppet cut from its strings. The attending leaned back in, resumed compressions. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, oxygen moving in and out of lungs that no longer cared if it arrived. 90 seconds. The clock on the wall read 0202. The attending straightened, his shoulders dropping like someone had removed a weight from his spine. He pulled his gloves off with the casual efficiency of someone who'd done this 100 times and knew which times had worked and which times simply ended. His eyes scanned the monitor one final rotation across the screen. Flat line. The sound it made was the sound of empty, a long continuous tone that meant nothing was happening and nothing would happen again. He set his hands down on the steel counter beside the crash cart and exhaled through his nose, a doctor's exhale, the kind that carries the weight of having tried everything and having it matter precisely zero. Time of death, 0202, he said to the room, and his voice was steady, professional, untouched by anything resembling emotion. The crash team began to move backward, pulling away like a tide receding. One nurse started unwinding the blood pressure cuff. Another reached for the ventilator tube. The room was already becoming a room again instead of a battlefield, already shifting from crisis to cleanup, from hope to documentation. Pierce stood in the hallway beyond the glass. His arms were crossed. His face held the expression of a man who had anticipated this exact outcome and had already begun writing the morning email in his head, the one about appropriate resource allocation, about knowing when to accept outcomes, about the importance of evidence-based medicine over intuition. He had his phone in his back pocket and a list of board members' cell numbers in his mind. He was already composing the narrative. This would be the incident that ended her? This would be the moment he could point to and say, "See? I told you. I tried to protect this hospital." Elena stood at the foot of the bed. She was staring at Hale's still chest, the kind of stillness that isn't peaceful, the kind that is final. Her face was a mask, had been a mask for 6 months, but something shifted behind the mask in that moment. The ice cracked. The trained composure fractured. Underneath was something else entirely. Something that had watched 47 people walk out of Tikrit alive because her hands didn't fail when everything else did. She moved to the door. The door that opened to the hallway. The door where Pierce was standing. She didn't open it. She closed it. The lock clicked into place with the sound of a choice being made. "Martinez, what are you doing?" the attending said. His voice carried the tone of someone asking a reasonable question of an unreasonable person. Elena didn't answer. Her eyes found the instrument tray, steel surface, surgical tools arranged in neat rows, everything sterile and ready. She flipped it. The metal shriek as it turned was like a warning alarm. Tools scattered across the floor, clattering, the sound of silver bouncing on tile. She reached for the scalpel. The blade caught the fluorescent light and threw it back like a signal. The attending moved toward her. "Step back from the patient right now." She didn't acknowledge him. Her hand moved to Hale's chest. One clean line. A cut that started at the sternum and didn't hesitate, didn't waver, had been practiced in places where there was no anesthesia and no time and nothing but a soldier's body between you and the mathematics of death. The blade went through skin, through fascia, through muscle with the kind of precision that comes from having done this when it mattered most. Hale's blood was warm. It always was. The attending grabbed her arm. "Stop. You're committing a felony. You." Elena's other hand cracked Hale's ribs apart. Not broke. Cracked. Used her hands like she'd been trained in a field hospital that officially never existed, where the generators failed and there was nothing but your hands and a soldier's chest cavity and the understanding that if you didn't get inside right now, you would walk out alone. Her ribs came apart like she was opening a door. The sound was the sound of cartilage separating, of bone giving way to will. Alarms began to scream. The heart monitor was still showing flat line, but Elena wasn't listening to the monitor. She was listening to Hale's body. She was feeling for what he needed. Her hands reached inside, no hesitation, no wasted motion, no part of her that was still the probationary nurse who answered to Dr. Pierce. Those hands had held lives together in the Jolan district when the mortars stopped falling and the only thing left between Tikrit and silence was her fingers and her training. Her ribs stayed open. The cavity exposed. Her hands found his heart, slick, still, cold against her palms. She wrapped her fingers around it and began to massage it with precise rhythm. 10 compressions. Pause. Feel. Compress again. Fists pounded on the glass door. Pierce's voice came through, muffled by the barrier. "Open that door right now." Security. Medical board violation. That is a felony. His composure had cracked. The rage was showing. The competent strategist had found the limits of his strategy and was now just a man watching his narrative dissolve in real time. Elena didn't hear him. She didn't hear anything except the counting in her head. She didn't feel anything except the heart beneath her hands and the blood slicking her palms and the knowledge that Hale had called out her call sign, Overwatch, which meant some part of him knew who she was, what she could do, why she would do something this reckless. 20 seconds. The monitor was still flat. She pressed harder. The heart needed to remember what it was. Needed to understand that surrender was not an option. Needed to feel her will transferred through her hands into its chambers. 30 seconds. 40. Hale's monitor spiked. 1 beat. Irregular, erratic, chaotic, but a beat. Not the organized electrical rhythm of a living heart, but the electrical whisper of a heart that was remembering. The attending's hands froze. The nurses stopped moving. The room held its breath. Elena kept working. Another beat. Then another. The rhythm was shaky, was unstable, was not yet safe, but it was there. It was present. It was the difference between dead and dying, and there was a world of difference between those two states. Her hands kept moving, kept massaging, kept the rhythm steady until the heart began to understand the pattern, began to sync with her compressions, began to acknowledge that Elena Martinez had not driven here at 0200 hours to accept an attending's time of death. The monitor climbed. 60 beats per minute. The rhythm stabilized. The attending was staring at her like she was something that shouldn't exist. The nurses were frozen. The security guard outside the door was still holding the keycard, unsure if breaking glass was his jurisdiction. Pierce was silent now. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. Could cut through it with a scalpel. Could feel the weight of it pressing against every decision he'd made. Elena finally opened the door. Her hands were covered in blood. Hale's blood. Her scrubs were wet. Her hair had come loose from the surgical cap. She looked like something that had clawed its way back from a grave, and that was precisely what she was. Security was waiting. 2 officers in Navy uniforms, already moving forward, already reaching for her arm, already preparing to escort her from the building. Pierce pushed past them. His face had cycled through shock to rage to something that looked like panic. He saw the open chest. He saw Elena's hand still positioned for the final compressions. He saw Hale's monitor showing steady rhythm, weak, but present, but alive. He saw his narrative collapse like a building with the load-bearing walls removed. "You just ended your career," he said. His voice was shaking. The careful precision was gone. What remained was a man watching his plan incinerate in real time. "You just committed surgical assault. You contaminated a crime scene. You violated every protocol in this hospital." Elena looked at him. Her eyes were not the eyes of the probationary nurse who had stood silently while he displayed her charting to an auditorium of residents. These were the eyes of someone who had held soldiers' lives in her hands and had never once let one fall. "His breathing," she said. 10 words. That was all. She turned to the security officers. "I'm ready." The next hours became a blur of paperwork and phone calls and the machinery of institutional consequence turning like a machine that had been waiting for permission to move. By 0600 hours, 2 board members had called the chief of staff. The call had come from Dr. Pierce's contact list, carefully cultivated, politically positioned, men who owed him favors or who believed him or who simply understood that a nurse who performed surgery without authorization was a liability to every hospital on the East Coast. By 0700 hours, an investigator had requested her full employment history. The request came with the tone of someone following procedures, checking boxes, building a case that would be airtight and irrefutable. By 0900 hours, her hospital keycard was deactivated. A security guard who didn't know her name escorted her through the employee corridor while cleaning out her locker, her 2 sets of extra scrubs, her name badge, the photograph someone had taken at the nurse's orientation, everything that marked her as someone who had worked here placed into a cardboard box that she could carry with both hands. The guard didn't make eye contact. He was simply following orders. That was the mercy of following orders. You never had to think about whether the orders were right. Elena had been ordered to disappear before. The first time had been from Tikrit, when the operation was buried, when her service record was scrubbed, when her decorations were filed in a vault she'd never see again, her existence a liability to men who needed the war to have cleaner lines. She had learned then what it felt like to be erased. To be a person who had never officially been anywhere. To carry secrets so classified that speaking them aloud would constitute a federal crime. She had learned that there were two kinds of death, the kind you died in a hospital bed and the kind you died while your heart was still beating. But she had saved Hale. That was the one thing that mattered. That was the thing that meant she could carry the cardboard box and watch the hospital recede and know that whatever happened to her now, Hale would walk out of St. Michael's alive. The rest was just consequence. The rest was the price you paid when you stopped being invisible. Pierce's hand shook as he dialed the first board member at 09 for 5 hours. The line rang 4 times. An assistant answered. "Mr. Hendricks is unavailable," she said, her voice rehearsed and hollow. He tried the second board member. Same response. The third. A receptionist informed him that Dr. Thornton was in meetings all week and could not be reached. His contact network, the one he'd spent 15 years cultivating, had evaporated between sunrise and mid-morning like steam off hot asphalt. By noon, Pierce sat in his office and tried to access the security footage himself. He needed the video from Trauma 2. He needed to prove Elena had acted without authorization, that she'd violated every protocol, that her actions, however miraculous, had been reckless and insubordinate. The IT department would give him the files. They always did. He called down to the basement server room where the cameras fed their endless recordings into the hospital's digital vault. A voice answered. "Kowalski here. I need the Trauma Bay footage from last night. 0200 to 02:15 hours. Silence. Then, you want the footage, Doc? Here's all of it." The security portal opened. Pierce pulled it up on his desktop monitor. The first clip played automatically. Timestamp 2300 hours, 2 days prior. Pierce in the medication room, his hand moving across the digital dispensing system, adjusting, altering, the dosage records on 3 separate cases. His chest tightened. The next clip, Pierce on his office phone at 2330 hours, his voice clear through the audio overlay. "Yeah, her next rotation should be with Hendricks and Vale. Both of them are litigious. Both of them document everything. Make sure she gets their worst cases." Kowalski had been documenting him. Not for days. For months. The clips continued. Pierce reviewing Elena's supply requisitions and hand-marking them with red flags that never should have been there. Pierce in the hallway speaking with security about her probationary status, his voice carrying the calculated certainty of someone orchestrating a removal. And then the financial records appeared on screen, spreadsheets that showed the pattern Kowalski had discovered, Pierce blocking Elena from specific rotations, always the ones involving durable medical equipment contracts, always the cases where unnecessary supplies had been ordered and billed to insurance at inflated rates. Somewhere in those rotations, Elena's military training would have made her obsessive about waste, about fraud, about the kind of systematic theft that military supply officers were trained to spot within weeks. Pierce leaned back from his monitor as if the screen itself had burned him. His hands were steady, but only because they were gripping the desk hard enough to turn his knuckles white. Kowalski, the IT administrator, the man with the faded purple heart tattoo on his forearm from his Desert Storm service, had been watching him. Documenting everything. And then Kowalski had sent it all to the State Medical Board at 1347 hours with a cover letter that took Pierce's breath away. Dr. James Pierce has been systematically altering patient records, manipulating staff assignments, and running a fraudulent billing scheme with Medcare Solutions Incorporated. The attached evidence spans 92 days and includes audio, video, and financial documentation. At 1400 hours, Pierce's hospital credentials were suspended pending investigation. At 1437 hours, the first board member's assistant called back. Mr. Hendricks asks that you not contact him again. Our legal team will be in touch with your attorney. Pierce's jaw clenched so hard he tasted copper. His carefully constructed authority, the kind that made supply nurses jump when he snapped his fingers, the kind that made residents afraid to contradict him in grand rounds, the kind that let him manufacture a termination for anyone who threatened his income stream, had collapsed in less than 5 hours. The investigator he'd hired to dig into Elena's background had already sent his final invoice and disappeared. The board members who'd taken his calls for 15 years were suddenly unavailable. His attorney was using words like cooperation and best possible outcome in the same sentence. At 1,615 hours, Pierce watched from his office window as Marines in dress uniforms escorted Elena across the parking lot. Not security guards. Not hospital staff. United States Marines in immaculate blues, their bearing like monuments, their presence making the afternoon light seem to bend around them. Elena walked between them with her jacket on, the faded patch still sewn inside the lining where only she could see it, where only she would ever know what it meant. One of the Marines was a captain. Not in rank. In bearing. The way he moved, the way they all moved, said they weren't there for a casual pickup. They were there for extraction. Pierce's nameplate was already off his door. The suspension letter was being drafted. 3 years without his medical license. 3 years of watching other physicians work while he sat in community college classrooms teaching CPR to teenagers who didn't care about chest compressions and recovery position. The humiliation was so complete, so thorough, that he couldn't breathe through it. He sat in his empty office, the desk already cleared, the walls already bare, and felt the weight of consequence pressing down on him like gravity had doubled. 6 months later, Dr. James Pierce taught CPR certification courses at Savannah Community College in a building that smelled like floor wax and broken dreams. He made $32,000 a year. His medical license remained suspended. The state board had handed down its decision in writing, 3 years without reinstatement eligibility, mandatory ethics retraining, and a permanent note in his file about the fraudulent billing scheme. Medical ethics seminars at 3 different universities now used his case as a cautionary tale. His name was no longer on the hospital website. His office had been given to a younger physician who'd never heard of him. Elena worked at a Veterans Administration hospital 2 states away, in a converted mansion that had been a plantation once and was now a healing space. Her office was small but hers. The walls were painted a soft gray. Her clearance had been partially restored under new terms she still couldn't fully discuss. Her jacket hung on the back of her door, the faded Tickrit unit patch sewn inside the lining where no one would see it but her. Sometimes she touched it when the weight of the work got heavy. Sometimes she let her fingers rest on the stitches and remembered what it meant to be needed in ways civilians could never understand. 3 weeks after her transfer, Hale sent her a message through official channels, back on active duty. Full recovery. Team wants to send commendation. Understand if you need quiet. M.H. Elena replied with 2 words, stay safe. The work at the VA was different than St. Michael's. The patients were different. They carried scars that no X-ray could show. A young veteran came in one Tuesday afternoon with hands that trembled and eyes that couldn't hold focus, nightmares he couldn't explain to civilian doctors, symptoms that made the local physicians reach for antipsychotics when what he really needed was someone who understood what combat did to the nervous system. Elena sat with him for 40 minutes after her shift ended. She didn't use clinical language. She didn't offer false reassurance. She just let him talk about the sounds that woke him at 0300, the way his body forgot it was stateside, the muscle memory that wouldn't let him sit with his back to a door. When he finally stood to leave, he turned at the doorway and said, "Thank you," and something in his voice said he knew she'd been where he was. Not in the same country, not in the same unit, but in that place between alive and haunted where only people who'd held life together with their bare hands could truly survive. Elena touched the patch inside her jacket, the stitching worn soft from years of her fingers finding it in the dark. The hospital was quiet in the evening light. The fluorescent panels had switched to their automated evening dimness. The sound of her keys locking her office door echoed down the hallway like finality. She didn't need anyone to see the medals. She didn't need the commendations framed on her wall or the official recognition that had finally, quietly, been restored to her record. She knew what she'd done in Tikrit. She knew how many lives she'd extracted under fire. She knew the exact weight of a human being when you were carrying them and running and praying their blood wouldn't soak through your jacket before you reached safety. Captain Elena Martinez walked to her truck in the savannah evening, the air warm and thick with humidity, the sky turning that particular shade of purple that meant rain was coming. She didn't need the world to know. The ones who'd seen the worst often gave the most. If you're enjoying this, please hit like and subscribe, it really helps the channel. And leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from.